Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is very formal for me today. This is usually the performance class for the Master of Music Performance Teaching, and all those students are here, plus a whole range of guests. And today we have Susie and Slava from Simon Fraser University in Canada, and they're going to give a fairly practical, performance-focused talk and performance on that covers performance anxiety. And I'd like you to make Susie and Slava very welcome.
Now, where did Ian go? Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Ian. Appreciate it very much. Susie and I do. And thank you for coming to our lecture recital. It is on a topic, of course, that we all feel very deeply about, I think. Even if we don't feel it the same way, we know what we're talking about when we talk about anxiety and its manifestations during performance. The big thing that we're going to be stressing today, I'm just going to say it right off the bat, is we're going to be talking about anxiety as more than just a negative experience. Can you all hear me very well, by the way? Oh, yeah. Is this better now? Okay, very good. So the idea is that most of us think of anxiety as a negative experience. And the work that we're doing and the research that we're doing, in fact, we see it as a relational thing, meaning it's related as well to a positive experience. So there is such a thing as positive anxiety. For all practical purposes, the term was coined by the great Danish philosopher Kierkegaard back in the early part of the 19th century. So I don't want to get into the theory right now. Instead, I'm going to start you off with a little narrative of my own. When I was 16 years old, which was really a very long time ago, and I was told by my piano teacher, Antonina Yaroshevich, who had studied at the Kyiv Conservatory. She told me one day, she said, Slava, in those days, because I was 16, it was Slavchik, which is a diminutive, an even further diminutive of Slava. She says, Slavchik, the time has come that you have to give your debut. And this was in Toronto. And in our city of Toronto, we had a hall called Massey Hall. And Massey Hall was I guess we could call it our Carnegie Hall. It was a hall where Rachmaninoff had played, all the great pianists. And so when she announced that to me, I immediately felt very excited, but also terribly nervous and inadequate about it. I thought, what right do I have as a 16-year-old to give a debut in this hall? But that's what she said, and we listened to our teachers. I hope we all do, when they summon us. So I had to do it, and I practiced very hard on my recital program, as you can well imagine. You all know what that means. And the day arrived on a blistery November winter's morning. I woke up. It was the first time I had to put on a tuxedo. I had never worn one before. It was really all quite scary, And then I arrived at the hall, and the dragon piano, I like to call it, was sitting out in that hall, and I had a chance to try it out. And with every minute that went by, I felt very, very nervous. The negative anxiety was attacking me. And when the time actually came to play the concert, and I was backstage with my, late and wonderful teacher, Antonina Yaroshevich, and the time came, when they said, okay, 1 minute to curtain time, and there we were standing backstage, and all of a sudden, I just as the moment the door opened and I'm supposed to go on, I couldn't do it. And I turned to my teacher and I said, Mrs. Yaroshevich, please forgive me, but I don't think I want to be a pianist after all. I said, I can't go out. I can't do it. And then she very gently said to me, she said, look out there. Do you see all those people there? They're here. They've made special arrangements to hear you play. Some of them had to get babysitters. Some of them had to, drive a big distance. They're here to hear you because they're interested. There's no reason for you to feel this way. So I looked out, as she said, but all I could see was 6,000 eyeballs glistening, in the dark. So I was frightened. I really was. And I thought, no, I cannot do this. I won't go on stage. And then she said to me, she said, Slav, take a deep breath. Just take a deep breath and look at them one more time. And then if you decide you don't want to go on, all right, I understand. So I listened to it. I took a big, deep breath. As much as I could. And then I looked out, and what did I feel? You watch hockey games? Perhaps they're not as popular in Australia, but you probably know about the body check of hockey. This is when a tank comes at you at 60 miles an hour, it seems, skating, and then they shove you. My teacher had extraordinary strength. She gave me a body check like I've never thought humanly possible, and I literally went flying into the air. I think she threw me a good 16 feet. And all of a sudden, I landed on the stage. And, people started clapping. And I remember thinking the most idiotic thought. I thought, I'll tell them I've got to go to the washroom. And then I'll make my exit that way. I see my dear friend Alan. Where are you, Alan? There you are. I'm not wearing my proper glasses, so my sight is somewhat limited. But I was so terrified. Now, Alan's the opposite of me, He didn't have this. Were you? Were you really? That's fantastic. Well, I'm glad you admitted it in front of all these people.
We're going to be talking about this today. You reminded me, I remember 40 years ago reading in Time magazine about Vladimir Horowitz's return to Carnegie Hall after years away.
Yeah.
And he couldn't go on stage. Same story as yours. And he left and he walked around Central Park by himself for an hour.
Yeah.
And he sat on a park bench. And a policeman came and said, "What's the matter?" He said, "I've got to go and play in Carnegie Hall for 3,000 people." And he says, "I can't do it." And the policeman said, "What are you worried about? I'm sure you know this music much better than anybody else in that hall."
That's right.
And Horowitz said, he was right. I thought, I practiced this music so much, I know it backwards and forwards much better than anybody. And even if I make mistakes, nobody's going to know.
Well,
he went back.
Alan Kogosowski, one of your most brilliant pianists, literally in the world, and I'm happy he's here. I feel very honored. I thought it was you, but my eyesight's not the greatest, but I'm glad I was right. Thank you, Alan. That's precisely it. So when I went on stage, I realized that, it'd be more embarrassing to tell them I've got to go to the washroom. So I went to the piano and I sat down. Now, the very first piece on the program was a Liszt Transcendental Etude, the D-flat major, which is also entitled Harmonie du Soir, Harmonies of the Evening. And I sat down, ready to play the piece. And I sat and I sat and I sat because I couldn't remember which A-flat to start on. Can you imagine the excruciating horror of that situation? Which A-flat was it? And then an inner voice said to me, "Look, stupid. You've been playing this piece a lot of times. You know which A-flat it is. Now stop this nonsense. Put your hand down, and you will find the correct A-flat." So I did. It wasn't easy, but I got through the first piece. And interestingly enough, the critic, or who wrote in particular that I remember, said something like this the next day. a young pianist, 16-year-old Yaroslav Senyshyn, came onto the stage. And unlike so many youngsters of his age, he sat down and he was serious. He really thought about his music. And so at a very tender age, I learned all about critics and their accuracy. So today, to start us off, I'm going to play this piece. And believe it or not, because it was the very first piece, I still feel the trepidation of playing it after all these years, because it's associated with that experience. So I played it many, many times, but I've always approached it with a certain amount of, here we go. So part of the business today of our presentation is we are our own guinea pigs, okay? So here we go.
So we're a bit like a tag team today. Can you hear me all right? Hello. So I'm not even going to tell you about some of my performance anxiety stories because they're so horrific that I'm not even going to go into them. But let it suffice to say that after deciding when I was 8 years old that all I ever wanted to do was play the flute for the rest of my life, and that would be my greatest joy and pleasure to be able to do that and be a performer, I then went on to suffer terrible, debilitating performance anxiety for many years and ended up quitting and not playing for over 10 years. And it wasn't until I met Slava, actually, that he got me back playing again. So what I'm going to do later today in braving a recital condition performance for you is, again, to be a guinea pig and to give courage and to say that, you know, as I'm sitting here, especially those of you that play flute out there, and I know there are many of you here, you'll know what you're feeling and what this is all about. And hopefully, you'll be able to take some messages away from today that we'll be able to start to apply. It's a practice. It's a state of being. It's like a yoga practice. It's a practice that we're trying to advocate to be able to get you through this kind of thing. But before we do, let me just give you a little bit of background about the research that we've done in order to get to this point. So not very long ago, I was teaching a class of teacher education students who want to become teachers, and they were in the arts education program, many of them in music. And I said to them, what's performance anxiety like for you? And here's some of the responses that we got. Well, it's like driving on a scary road trying to avoid a car accident. That's one of them. It's like going to the dentist. It's like being in a snowsuit in the desert. That's typically Canadian, I think, snowsuit. The responses were unanimous. It was threatening, frightening, and painful. There's no doubt that when we feel that fear, that initial, what you might categorize as stage fright, that your body has activated that fight or flight response. And there's a whole lot of undesirable or harmful things that you believe are about to or already happening to you. I will say the list. You can tick off how many you might have suffered or felt yourself or know someone who has. Edginess, apprehension, dry mouth, swallowing difficulty, hoarseness, rapid breathing, rapid heartbeat, palpitations, twitching or trembling, muscle tension, headaches, backache, sweating, difficulty in concentrating, dizziness or fainting, nausea, diarrhea, weight loss, sleeplessness, fatigue, irritability, nightmares, memory problems, and the rest. Okay, not pleasant. But that's why we've been given minds, all right? Evolution gave us this fight and flight response. We're going to feel it. It is absolutely normal. It's part of our biology. We cannot stop it, even if we wished that we could. But we've been given these powerful minds, and that's what we need to evoke and use in order to counteract all of these things we're going to feel. The other thing we need to recognize is these feelings are just a signal. They're a signal from the body that something very different is about to happen to you. It doesn't need to be a signal that is necessarily negative. We don't have to interpret it as always the signal means I'm in danger. This is a fearful, dangerous situation for me. We have to cultivate the fact it's a signal and how we can move on. I think, and we have done a lot of work looking into this, one of the biggest problems we have in overcoming performance anxiety is that we don't have a very good model of how to understand what it is. We mostly view it from within a medical model, where if we could just control the symptoms or cure it, heaven forbid, everything would be okay. And we also look at it very much within a kind of psychological deficit model. So it's equated through research with all kinds of negative things. So high performance anxiety means low self-esteem, or perfectionism, or low personal control, or a predisposition to irrational beliefs, poor coping ability, distractibility, uncertainty, confusion. I mean, no wonder we feel inadequate when we feel these responses, if this is the model and this is the equation. So our research that we did over a decade ago now started us off on this journey of talking to hundreds and hundreds of people, gathering, collecting stories. And we started with music students who had just spent 4 years in their degree program wanting to become performers, and they're about to give their final performance recitals, and there's a lot on the line for them. We interviewed them over time, and what we found was quite interesting, that the students, by and large, tend to view anxiety as a real thing. This thing, it's not them. Now, anxiety is not me. This is a thing, like a disease that's going to attack me. They believed that they needed to develop particular strategies for overcoming that perceived negative effects of anxiety. And this tended to be based on the assumption that they could find an absolute or correct way of preventing or overcoming anxiety. In fact, they believed this was possible to achieve. And sometimes they even believed that, teachers and people, masterful musicians, were keeping the secret from them. What's the secret? And why don't they tell us? So there's a really mystique and myth about it. They also used a very common metaphor in talking about it, and you can listen to this. When you listen to how people talk to you about their performance anxiety, try to listen to the framework they're placing around it, because it tells you a lot about, the assumptions they're making. These students tended to use a battle or a fight metaphor between themselves and their anxiety. So saying things like, I want to go out there and I want to beat my nerves. Hopefully nerves won't get the better of me. And this conflict tended to be resolved by resorting to this idea that the more experience you have of performing, the less anxious you will be. All right, so they really, really believe that. And of course, we know that quite often, the older you get, the more experienced you get, then performance anxiety can kick in all over again to a really, really large extent, detrimental extent. So one quotation from a student, I think if you did it every day, then the nerve aspect would, obviously get better. But then if you choose that way of life and you want to do that every day, then fine, and you'll obviously get better and you'll be able to cope with nerves. Because the students perceived themselves to have relatively little experience of performing, they were able to rationalize the possibility of failure as resulting from their lack of experience, rather than their lack of ability as a performer. And this was also a way in which they would try to protect their sense of worth as a musician. So in other words, if the performance doesn't go well, it's not my fault, it was anxiety's fault. That nervous, awful anxiety is what ruined my performance. I could have played brilliantly if it hadn't kicked in. Again, a quotation, I don't have the control, but on the other hand, sometimes it's quite nice thinking that I don't have ultimate responsibility as well, because I know more or less on the day that if I play my bit okay, then if anything goes horrendously wrong, then it won't be ultimately mine, down to me, my kind of responsibility. I'm trying different ways of thinking about playing philosophically, mostly, because I do get so nervous, but I'm not sure whether it helps or not. But hopefully I will come up with something that really works. So it's constant striving. And as you know, even if you find that thing that really works for you now, it doesn't mean you'll wake up tomorrow and that thing will work for you then. And this is the other problem, is that we don't tend to we all invoke different strategies. We have teachers who tell us these wonderful ideas and tools, and they could work for a little while, and then one day they just don't work anymore. And then what? Then you're always feeling that you really haven't addressed the underlying issues. Students believe that overcoming anxiety could be achieved primarily through developing their self-confidence. This is, again, a common misconception. All right, if we just keep getting more and more confident, then I'll feel less and less nervous. All right, believe me, they are not correlated. You can be the most confident person, out there imaginable, and you can still feel debilitating performance anxiety. Self-confidence was thought to be achieved through various activities. They thought if they did special performing rituals, positive thinking, social support, everybody telling you how good you are, positive evaluations of your competence, and a sustained effort and practice on your instrument, that would all work. There was also concern about being one's own worst enemy or self-sabotaging your own potential. So a lot of interesting things. I'm sure that there are things that you can, imagine being possible in these situations that the students had to say, but this was a little bit of an overview. So basically, we're going to go into a sense of, why is it that our subconscious seems to want us to fail? All right, so does our subconscious want us to fail?
My guys, it's going to help. Now, this is a very important question, and it was one that was asked to a remarkably good pianist. We all know this pianist, Claudio Arrau, the late Arrau, of course. And the Horowitz is not, of course, Latimer Horowitz. It's a different Horowitz, Joseph Horowitz, asking the question. You often talk about, say, memory lapses in terms of self-destructive tendencies, as if they were a part of your subconscious that wanted you to fail. Arrau said, almost every performer has to fight against escaping into failure. How do you feel when you're playing and something goes wrong? I used to think it was the end of the world. It sometimes took months for me to recover. I wanted to be perfect, divine, beyond any flaw or memory mistake, but this always produces the opposite effect. Now I don't get so upset. You know what would happen in my very early years if something went wrong? I gave up. I kept playing, but I gave up, as if the rest didn't count. Very beautiful quotation from a great author. Mistakes are the portals of discovery. Meaning, of course, that mistakes in themselves need not be bad things if we know how to relate to them.
This situation's a little odd. Often we dialogue between us, so we're kind of doing this back and forth thing today. I don't know. Anyway, we have this very interesting encaustic painter in Canada, Tony Sherman. And Slav and I had the opportunity to meet him and speak with him recently. And he has this interesting idea about mistakes, so I thought I'd bring it in here. This is his technique, is he layers wax, colored wax, on canvas, and it gives this kind of dripping, heavy effect, if you like. This is one of his pieces called The Nun. And it was really interesting because he's talking about this piece, and he said how a lot of people take that side of the face and they make some really fabulous interpretations about it. You know, it's like, you know, there's this exploding consciousness, or there's this, you know, coming into being, and all kinds of possibilities around what that space created. Well, in fact, what happened is he created the face, and the jawline, he felt, was too stiff. It was too defined, the jawline, and it didn't actually look realistic anymore. It started to, you know, look as if, well, just not like a real jawline would look. And so he went over with his blowtorch and he torched it. He torched the mistake, and this is what he ended up with. And of course, it's had, you know, rave reviews, and it's how profound it is that this piece of the face is doing what it's doing in this way. You know, often his message was that people who think about mistakes always think that they're going to be the disaster, they're going to be the end or a kind of failure, and not necessarily the idea that they really are opportunities. They are opportunities for expansive understanding of ourselves, opportunities for growth each time they happen, each time we reflect on them in particular, not when we just kind of sweep them under the carpet and pretend, you know, oh, we won't even discuss it. Another example, too, is the famous painter Rubens. Now, everyone knows that Rubens has, you know, not the best technique, if you like, when it comes to necks. For some reason, this fabulous painter liked to either cover up necks to avoid painting them, or else there were always kind of odd oddities around the neck. This is a self-portrait. And what's fascinating about Rubens is that he was known for saying once that it was the real problem he felt was that if he painted necks accurately, if he painted what we actually see when we see a neck, then on canvas the neck doesn't look real anymore. Okay, so that's another interesting idea, and there's a kind of an illusion goes on, that even if we make an exact performance, we're note perfect, as you know, right? It doesn't mean that translates with any kind of connection or meaning with how people perceive our sound. And I think that this is another thing to keep in mind, that we're always trying to work on what we're doing in terms of connection and connecting to others, and knowing that the exact copy is not really always what we're after here. So we undermine our performance through all kinds of things. Inadequate preparation, inability to recognize what constitutes adequate preparation, fear of criticism, and fear of failure, fear of success. Slava could talk about that later if we have questions on that one. And misconceptions regarding so-called performing skills and so many more things. So why do we do it?
Some of you may be thinking because we're masochists, but that's not the real reason. We do it because we're in love with the music. We need to communicate it, and we're willing to risk whatever it takes to do that. Martin Heidegger is a 20th century philosopher who was able to reiterate the idea that I spoke earlier about Kierkegaard's notion of positive anxiety. And the simple truth is Heidegger relied quite heavily on Kierkegaard, as did Sartre and other existentialists. But both Sartre and Heidegger were not generous enough to admit it. So it always takes the scholars to find these things out later. At any rate, he wrote, very aptly, "We are time-orientated beings, constantly projecting ourselves into the future. This creates anxiety and an awareness of our being and mortality." We pick up this anxiety when we're already little children. Little kids know, for example, at a very young age, that someday they're going to be gone. They learn that quite quickly. So there's a duration to time. We are mortal. So each one of us has our own unique time, and each one of us will depart in our own unique time. A performer's awareness of time can create an anxiety because the circumstances, possibilities, and the outcome of one's performance can never be fully predetermined. This in itself creates a certain anxiety over time, meaning that the variables that we cannot anticipate can happen. It happened to me on Wednesday. I don't know how many of you saw me in recital on Wednesday. It doesn't matter. I came out, took my bow, sat down, and started to play. And then all of a sudden, there was a very, very strange sound in the room. I had never heard anything quite like it. And it frightened me completely, threw me off. It took me quite some time to get over it before I finally realized that it was just a wonderful human being who was disabled but loved music. And he was humming with me, performing with me. But I didn't get it that way, you see. My first reaction, because I didn't know about this, I was completely, surprised and even worried to death that somehow the sound meant that I wasn't playing well, you see. I mean, how in heaven's name can one prepare for everything that can happen in a concert hall? Now, as it turned out, when I finally figured it out, I had the pleasure, when I bowed to him to thank him for his singing, because he was helping me. And I actually started to enjoy his singing. By the time I got to the end of the recital, he was co-authoring with me. And I thought, he likes my playing. I'll play even better, But these are the kinds of things that can happen at any time. All kinds of things. Performers can tell you story after story after story of all the things they never expected. Another one, just to give you an example of the performer's life, I actually chose this particular piano. I think it's called it doesn't matter. It's Ian's, I believe it's Ian. That's right. Ian's piano, and you're Ian as well, right? That's right. I called him Jim earlier, and Lord knows, it's probably my anxiety already thinking about this lecture. So, that is very, very important. Now, what happened is the piano was supposed to have, it was a problem. The second lowest G during rehearsal was not making a sound but a clanking noise. I arrived anticipating it would be fixed. But through nobody's fault, and these things happen all the time in the concert world, there was a miscommunication, and so the piano wasn't. And all of a sudden, I was faced with an instrument that perhaps I didn't want to play on as much. But you learn to accept these things, because that's life. We cannot predetermine everything, not just in performance, but in all walks of life. And that is a very important thing for us to accept. It's like the weather. It's like getting angry at the weather person, right? Weather woman, weather man, who says, oh, it's going to be a great weekend. And it turns out rotten. And you had planned to go on a great holiday. And you're angry at this weather person. But think of how silly that is, at the end of the day. Now, the famous pianist Claudio Arrau said, we do the most inexplicable things. We frustrate ourselves constantly out of fear. Fear of failure, and strange as it may seem, fear of success as well. We artists suddenly fall sick before major appearances. We create frightful emotional upsets. The least sign of imperfection can cause one to give up in the middle of an otherwise fine performance. Worst of all, the struggle may suddenly lose all meaning, and the artist, lost in a terrible maze of conflict and despair, may give up performing altogether. This giving up is a real death, the death of the soul. Never give up. Come hell or high water. For the performer, the performance is not a property of science. It is an event in direct relation to an extension of the performer. Performers have to try to identify and work through rather than evade or suppress their particular and underlying negative anxiety. That means let it happen. Allow it to happen. We keep changing this lecture, by the way. This is why we keep asking ourselves.
He's got a nice reading voice.
Thank you, ma'am. So, we now finally arrive to the crux of the matter, this business of positive anxiety, which Heidegger had referred to as a creative yearning. Creative yearning. This is a very important concept because you have to spend hours and hours, not just doing the mechanicus and all the stuff that we have to do to prepare for recitals, but you have to want to do it. You've got to talk yourself into it, and you've got to think of it in a yearning way. I want to go on stage, and I want to create beautiful sounds. It's a creative yearning. So, anxiety cannot be entirely purged from our lives. Even if it were possible to do so, it would not be desirable. For anxiety in its milder manifestations has a stimulating effect upon us. It spurs us on to action. It is a motivator without which our human faculties become blunted. We have to live with our anxieties, and it is the task of education to help us bear them.
I just wanted to add there that it's interesting about blunting effects. We all know that there are those who will consider taking medication, beta blockers to avoid the nerves, or also there's a lot of self-medication through alcohol and other means to try to combat it. And the thing that I'll say about that, without talking too much about it, we can talk about it later if you'd like, is that we know we cannot selectively numb. We just do not have that potential and that capacity, not with science yet anyway. And so anyway, as you're numbing the effects of your debilitating nerves or so you think, you're also numbing other things, and things that you may not be aware of. I know musicians who say, oh, no, all I'm numbing is, or all I'm changing is that my hands don't shake now. Well, it's actually not quite the case. You're numbing certain things that have to do with this heightened awareness, this stimulation that you're usually used to feeling and working with. You're changing something about your body, and that also has an effect, again, on how you're going to be able to communicate. And the last thing I'll say about that, too, is that one of the things that helps us connect with our audience is our vulnerability. It's our vulnerability up here. That's our humanness. That's the thing that people come to see. believe it or not. They come to see the human performance. And so as much as you're trying to mask that vulnerability so that you feel as if now I'm the competent, confident performer, you're also alienating yourself with that very same thing from making a connection sometimes to your audience. So it's the humanness as well that we're after. And as Slava pointed out, positive anxiety in its positive manifestations, Heidegger says it can take on this creative yearning, as he says, this desire. What is needed, we think, is a reconceptualization of anxiety in its relational terms. We're not trying to be utopian here or wildly new age in the idea of saying, let's get rid of negative anxiety altogether. We're just trying to say we need a perspective on this where we appreciate the fact that it's actually relational. It's not so one-sided. Martin Buber conceptualizes the idea of dialogue. As you know, dialogue isn't one-sided either. Dialogue is about this realm of the interhuman. It's the sphere of the in-between. It involves immediacy of the personal encounter that makes mutuality possible. The world created through dialogue of this form is a vital mingling of people where reality lies not with one or the other, but in relation. This is the relational approach. We believe the relational approach is needed for thinking about performance anxiety and also for overcoming it. Okay, in a great sense, thinking much more about you and your audience and the connections that you're trying to make. So you might kind of look at it this way. So one way to say is it's kind of a balance. Another way to look at it is there is one anxiety, and it's whether you choose to look at this side of the coin and say, oh, anxiety is negative, or this side and say it's positive, but it's still anxiety. It's still there. During the performance, there's great tension between the performer's sense of a kind of pre-existing fixed self and his or her emergent self on stage. This is another important point. Our emergent selves are based on processes so shifty, so ungrounded, that we have an apparent paradox between the solidity of what appears to show up and its groundlessness. Trying to avoid or resist this tension can result in this anxiety, again, in its most negative manifestations. So an easy kind of bottom line way of saying that is we have this sense that we are a fundamental core self, that we're a relatively stable human being, that the human being we are in the practice room is the same one that's going to walk out on stage. And it's just not the case. We have enough mounting evidence in psychology and other fields now to look at the fact that we're always constructing our sense of self in our context. Our context changes, so does our sense of self. And I think this is one of the things that can throw the wobblies to such a large extent, because you come out and you don't feel right. You don't feel like you. And it's that people, and then you feel like you've got to control something to get back to that feeling of what you think is you. But the you you're going for is the one you're holding in memory that's in that comfy environment, your home environment, your practice room, your surroundings, which are quite different from this interactive surrounding. So you need to really appreciate you're going to feel different and be different when you walk out on stage. That's a good thing. That's the positive thing that can come from it. The actual performance is an extension of being. It's self and anxiety and together. It's this relational thing. The performer tends to have a fixed or frozen notion of being this self and anxiety. Again, that's something that you can change and transform. It's a fixed sense of self that we project into the future. It's a fixed sense of self we expect to find on stage.
So we're back to that interview between Joseph Horowitz and Claudio Arau. Horowitz asks, what determines whether anxiety has a positive or negative impact, whether you use it creatively or destructively? Arau replied, I don't know how it happens exactly. 30 years ago, anxiety would often get in the way of performance. But with time, I understood that one should try to simply let things happen and not worry so much about pleasing or succeeding. Then anxiety becomes less of a handicap and more part of the creative stream. We're going to perform for you a sonata for flute and piano entitled Undine by not a very well-known but a very fine composer in my opinion, and Susie's opinion, Reinecke, who was fascinated by the Undine mythology. You know, it goes back for quite some time. But the idea is you may go fishing one of these days, and while you're fishing, especially if you're a male fisherman, you may catch a mermaid, or you may catch a nymph, depending on which particular mythology you may, be victimized by. The idea is that this nymph or mermaid is a remarkably beautiful woman, an Undine, and she is seeking a soul. And the only way she can have a soul is if the fisherman falls in love with her and marries her and has a child with her. Then she can gain her soul. The problem is, though, as soon as she gains her soul, she begins to age. So she warns her fisherman that if you marry me and have a child with me, you must promise me that you will always be faithful to me. Unfortunately, in this situation, the fisherman is not faithful. As his nymph gets older, he begins to get a yearning to be unfaithful. And one day, Undine finds her husband in the stable with another woman in his arms. And Undine is remarkably unhappy because he's, for all practical purposes, finished her off, and so she curses him. She says, if you fall asleep, you won't be able to breathe. There's an illness for that. It's an anxiety illness for people who sometimes, when in their sleep, stop to breathe. So, in this composition, water, seductive dialogue between Undine and the fisherman, and ultimately having to sink back into the depths of water. Undine comes from the Latin anda, which is wave, so water. Lots of water.
And you can give us some applause to cheer us on.
I think you were actually begging for that applause. No, I'm going to bring down the lid, yeah?
Yes.
That's heavy.
you very much. Most appreciated. Yes, let's plug this back in. So we're going to move into a last little bit, give you some tips that we have come up with in response to this work and research that we've done, and then open it up for your questions, observations, anything at all. To work. Just get our computer to wake up here. There it goes. Yeah, the computer decided to go to sleep. It's turning back on, but anyway, while it turns back on, yes, so,
See, they have indeterminate selves as well. They're machines.
So how many of you were feeling the performance anxieties with me? And how many of you felt it with me? Could you feel the tension? And how many of you could feel the battle of tensions between when you're, like I say, I often see it as the tension's always there, and it's that's really keeps driving the performance, right? That I tried to use the tensions. Of course I felt them, but I tried not to let them be debilitating. I tried to keep using them to push forward, right? To create it. And I think that it's really interesting in a lot of areas of work these days, not just in performance anxiety. People are realizing how much we have shied away from tensions. For example, we've always tried to say, well, in our teaching situations, we'd like to create opportunities for our students to always feel successful. We'd like to create opportunities, where there's lots of harmony, and we avoid any conflict, we avoid any tensions. And of course, what happens is inevitably they come up, and they will happen. It's part of human nature. And if you haven't developed any strategies for helping you overcome those difficulties, those obstacles, those tensions, if you haven't learned not to take everything personal and to heart the minute a bit of conflict arises, right, the minute a bit of disharmony happens, then you really do find that we have much more trouble, more difficulty. So what we've been working, lots of areas of life have been saying, and dialogue's been fascinating for this. So if you read up on dialogue, I'm thinking David Bohm, for example, and a wonderful book by Isaacs. So if you look up what Isaacs has written on dialogue, I think you could find a lot of inspiration from that. And the reason being is that it's talking about the fact that we don't have to always agree for harmony, for things to move forward. We can actually have different positions. We can occupy very different positions on a point of view. As long as we're listening, which is a key thing to each other, we're respecting the space between us, not just, a hierarchical kind of respect, but a space of what's happening in the exchange. As long as we're suspending judgment as much as possible, so we're attending to our biases, the things that could get in the way from us really listening properly to what someone has to say. We're bringing those biases out and acknowledging them. And as long as we're also voicing, meaning we're continually also not suppressing or trying to imitate an inauthentic voice, but we're trying to find what is our voice, right? Our authentic voice. So those four kind of principles of dialogue have been really, really helpful, I think, in carrying what I've been trying to work with in the performance situation. And of course, it's really difficult because what I do here is very, in some ways, disgenuine because I'm not a performer. So I'm a professor, I sit in universities, I do research, I do administration, chairing our department, and all those things that we do in life and teaching, and I don't perform. So I'm putting myself out here to perform as part of this lecture recital because I believe in the educative potential of it. I believe that the only way to really help with anxiety is to bring it out in the open and to work with it in education, far more than we do. And we need to open up more dialogue. We need to get people talking about it from a very young age so it becomes really a shared understanding that they start to develop, rather than this mystique or things we just put Band-Aids on or we brush over. It needs a genuine dialogue, because from that comes some understanding of it. And with understanding will come the potential, I think, to move through it more. So I think that we've got this back up again, although it's not showing up on the screen. So I'll just see what I need to do here. Any tips? Where's our technician gone?
Let's go to that, because we don't need it on the screen. We'll just talk.
It's trying to come, but
Let's just go to that. As long as we can see it.
got it back. Persevered here. Okay. Yes. David Bohm, yep. Isaacs. Okay, so we're almost. That was speed reading version of our talk. Okay. All right, so I'll start us off. We've talked about staying in the immediacy of the performance. This is something you have to practice doing. Okay, it's not something you can just count on having when you have to practice presence, you have to practice mindfulness, you have to practice staying in your immediacy. And we all know that we're told that. No, don't worry what's coming up ahead. Don't worry about that nagging voice that says, oh, here's that difficult passage, or here's that thing that you never hit properly. You will deal with them when you're there in their immediacy. So I think, again, all of these tips that we say are not something that you just say. They're not strategies that you just but they're practices that you do as you're performing all the time. So all of your practices with immediacy and mindfulness, and then you'll do that also here much more naturally. Never forget that an inaccuracy during a performance always seems much greater to you than it ever will to your audience, or even to yourself at a later time. Slava gives some examples about Richter talking about this, hearing his performances, thinking they're terrible, and then hearing a tape afterwards and thinking,
Not afterwards, 20 years later.
Oh, okay, 20 years later.
He couldn't listen to it in this particular situation for 20 years. Nobody could talk him into it. And finally, 20 years later, he sat down, listened to it, and he said, oh, I guess it wasn't that bad, you see? So this is a very important point, a very important point.
It's amazing how quickly negative anxiety will build up if you forget to breathe, and all too common a problem in performance. So we think as a singer or as a woodwind player or a brass player that would be obvious. It's still not obvious because it's the type of breathing that's happening is so different.
The thing is, the problem is, we forget to breathe. This is a common occurrence in any kind of performance. Have you ever watched runners? When they run in the races, their coaches are always saying to them, take a deep breath. Don't forget to breathe. I even go so far in my musical scores when I'm, I actually write down in the most important places, breathe stupid.
Don't breathe stupid, but breathe.
Because we forget, in that anxiety, we forget to breathe. So this is a very important point.
Again, it's a practice, right? So we're actually taking for granted, I think in a lot of cases, I'm thinking about flute playing and flute teaching, the students will be breathing, okay, they never really think about it. They mark the breaths and then they take them, and that's the end of it. But again, it's a practice. It's a practice of actually breathing. And somehow, even making that unusual is really helpful. So in other words, where you would breathe just in a normal phrase, instead you take the breath really differently in practice just to see. You experiment. You experiment trying it differently so that then you can see what it's like when it feels normal. That's one of the things we don't do enough of, is that extremes. Just like we have to push our instruments into the ugly. We have to play ugly before we know just how to back off ugly, right? Before it's too much, and that's the same idea. That tension all the time, and finding the place where that happens is important. Keep imagining a successful outcome. Banish those negative images. This is not always easy to do, we know, but forcing yourself to imagine a successful outcome should become a habit. Right? Imagine the sound you want in your performance, and imagine how good it'll feel when it's all over. That's kind of a separate point. But the first one, the sound, that was the other thing that really helped me when I was getting to the point where I couldn't play at all in front of people. It was just to go into the sound as much as I could, a complete focus on what it was. Again, I did that by trying to find new things in the sound, trying to recognize things I'd never heard before, trying to listen for more intensely to harmonies, to this intermingling of sound. And as I found, any time when I started slipping in this performance, in feeling like it wasn't, then I tried to bring the focus back with that. So focus, concentration on the sound. And it really does help, I think, take away some of the distractions that are happening in the mind. Concentrating as hard as you can sounds obvious. It's amazing how we don't concentrate when we practice, and yet we expect to concentrate when we step out here onto the stage. So again, it's a practice, isn't it, to be able to do that focus concentration all the time. I was really fortunate, I think, as a child, that when my grandfather gave me the flute, when I was 8 years old, to learn how to play it, he said, this is a really magical thing, and it'll make you happy and you'll make it happy if every time you play it you try to make the most beautiful sound you possibly can. And he gave that kind of notion about sound as the center of what this was all about. And I think that was really helpful. Not dwelling on making mistakes. So no one is perfect. And you, Slava, usually say this line. No one is perfect. He usually says, not even you. But we know that. So don't demand the impossible of yourself. The Buddhist monk would say that this is foolishness. Remember that audiences as a whole are benign. They're innately good. If this were not true, the human race would have disappeared off the face of the earth many years ago. We have the sense here that they're not the enemy. They're not looking for every flaw in your performance. And if they are, well, you don't know. It's not worth knowing about that, really. What they're really there for, quite often, is they're there to be inspired. They are there to feel something. They're there to grow and develop, and that's why they come. And so they want that sense of, what is it that I can do to inspire somebody else, and or create a desire, or even a creative yearning back again. And learning to tap into the audience's goodness, because they're there, they want to hear you, as Slava told you before. They made special arrangements. Never worry about possible exceptions to the rule. Negative members of an audience are not worth your thoughts or apprehensions. And yet, society as a whole, not necessarily a specific audience, but as a whole, society has to take some responsibility for promoting this construction that we have of negative anxiety. And we do that because we have created such a lot of sweeping it under the carpet, not bringing it out into the open, this whole notion of myth that I talked about around it, the notion that if I start talking about it too much, I'll start feeling more of it. I'll get worse if I talk about it. And also just kind of showing sometimes this callous disregard for art and artists and what they do. For example, expecting perfection and having expectations that most human beings would find difficult to meet, let alone those that we're trying to educate and trying to foster growth in terms of their musical potential. Also treating concerts as commodities and so on. Slava, you did this slide. I know you did. This is his slide, I know. I said you definitely wrote this slide because you've had a lot of these experiences with having to listen to negative critics and things that have come across, and that can in turn feed back into this sense of anxiety and its negative manifestations.
That's right.
Good. So we're almost there. Learn to sense and encourage anxiety's presence by working through it, not evading it. And if at it's possible best, anxiety really can take that form of a creative yearning, this great desire, then embrace that emergent self and the possibilities that positive anxiety provides. And because Ian told us that you would have many of you here interested in teaching and instrumental teaching, I did bring one slide. I can't get it to work. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, I'll work on that, and you start taking questions.
All right, we'll do that.
Okay.
Please feel free to ask whatever you want to. Even those thoughts, there's no such thing as an embarrassing thought, okay? Not in this context. Yes, Alan. It is Alan, I know now. Even though I can't see you, it's completely out of focus, but I sense it's you.
all very fine. But everything I've heard this afternoon is about how we feel, how we react, how we respond, how we, whether we should breathe or concentrate, and how we should feel about the audience, etc., etc. There's a very simple solution to all of this. This is not about us. It's about the music. If you're a speaker, it's about the ideas that you're to deliver. The minute you forget about yourself, you will have no anxiety. And it's got nothing to do, the subject matter here has got nothing to do with us at all.
Well,
this is what the Garden of Eden was all about. That's what original sin was about. The apple was that the human tasted of the fruit of self-knowledge, and he got kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Now, Arau, I knew Arau. He was a very, very pathetic, crippled person, psychologically crippled all his life. He saw a psychiatrist for 70 years. He could hardly speak, he was so shy. And that has nothing to do with the music. The man was terrified of his own shadow because he was thinking about himself all the time. What is going to befall me? Is the audience going to disapprove if I play a wrong note? You've got to turn that around completely. I owe it to Beethoven to play the right notes. And the only way you can do that is by listening to music, listening to Beethoven and expunging your ego entirely. You just listen to it until you hear the sound of Beethoven. And as long as you say, how do I feel about this? How is the audience reacting to me? You're going to get it wrong. You're going to have anxiety. I know a writer who taught me a golden rule for writing as a music critic, but for all writers. But critics do this all the time. The minute you start a sentence with I, it's going to be bad. It's going to be wrong. Because it's going to say it's going to be about that writer, not about the music, not about the performer. And that writer is going to be, it's just going to be a completely aggressive, wrong sentence. You've just got to describe what you're hearing.
All right.
When you perform,
Let me
you've got to go out there and listen.
Let me answer what you're saying,
Get rid
Alan.
of
Let me
yourself
answer.
and listen.
Let me answer by saying, because I'm going to surprise you, okay? Because you're absolutely right. That's the whole point of this lecture. The whole point is if you draw on positive anxiety and creative yearning, then that's the whole point. Then that I, that fixed self, is no longer the constant. It's not the anchor. So what you've told us is precisely the result of positive anxiety. Now with Arau, well, of course he had problems. We all do. But at the end of the day, he was saying the same thing, that it's not that important at all to be divine, to be the I, as it were. Because if indeed you're drawing on the positive anxiety, your job is yearning for that sound. So we're on the same page here, you see. We're not on opposite pages.
But we don't want to draw on it. Anxiety is about us. We've got to forget about it. It's almost a Buddhist kind of thing. We've got to...
Well, you're right. But Alan, that's precisely it.
I was telling you, I listen to YouTube a lot. You're listening to playing a piece of music, and you listen to different performances of it. You go through different ones very quickly, and you say, "Oh, that Horowitz does it like that. Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's good. That's interesting. It's a little faster. It's a little slower." Whenever you put on Richter, mistakes are all. You say, "Ah, yes, that's Beethoven. That's right." You forget about the form
thank you.
completely.
I'm going to stop you because I know we don't have much time, and you and I and Selvin would have lots of conversations about it afterwards. I do appreciate what you've said. I think everyone has. But I do want people to have opportunity to ask a few questions. I see one at the back. Thank you.
Okay, it's more, rather than just give you a specific question, generate whether we can have a discussion about this aspect that I think you've articulated. I think your research that you did about how you have that sense of yourself and your identity, and that you emerge as a performer on the stage, that you're a changing being, is quite interesting. because you're constantly processing the way that you perceive the future of the performance is going to be. And it's how well you can integrate those uncertainties and those distortions in your sense of who you are and your identity when you're performing. I had crippling performance anxiety and quit music for 2 years before changing genres within music after that. But addressing the fundamental, like when I'm teaching, I've been teaching singing at TAFE for 4 years now. Addressing the fundamental relationship that we have to music and how we approach it is really important, because when you get up at the end of the day, I think one of the most destructive thought patterns that I had back then that was so crippling was the idea that you had to sound good. And I'm obsessed with sound. I'm a very auditory-driven kind of person with a bit of perfectionism. But sort of breaking, I guess the thing that I want to sort of open up to see what you thought about is, well, the role of aesthetic judgment. You know, so of course we're performing music in a social context and in a historical context that has certain benchmarks and performance conventions and whatnot. But how do we integrate that as performers, and is it really useful as a performer to get up and have an aesthetic judgment of the art in and of itself? What other function can it play when we're being the medium of the performer?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's always exciting to hear from someone who has had to think a lot and has thought a lot about these issues. And you've put a very interesting angle on this idea too, that as you were talking, I'm almost thinking about the difference between being and becoming. And the idea is that that sound, for example, that you spoke about is always an ideal that we are working towards. It's not the thing that we actually achieve and meet. You know, we don't say, well, I've got it now, that's it, I'm all set. So it's always that thing that we have to recognize. You know, it's art, creativity, all these things are ideals that we're always striving towards. And as we strive towards it, we're in a constant state of becoming. So we're always becoming within relation to that art form. And I think that we have two things that have counteracted that idea. One is achievement-orientated focus, right, where it's all about, achieving, and I will achieve it, and it will be perfection, and therefore it will be good enough. That is part of the problem. And this idea of being, the idea that we're already being something, right? And think how important that is to us. We have I've done lots of research where I see fabulous young people playing instruments, and I'll say to them, so what does it mean to you to be a musician? And I get, oh, I'm not really a musician. Right, so even being, as in taking the label, taking the category for ourselves, is complicated for people and creates a lot of problems. So I think that sense of becoming, does that address a little bit? But I think you've got a lot of depth to what you've been thinking about. Any other questions?
I'm just going to come back to this point, which I think is very, very important. And that is that, of course, ideally, as one performs, one would love to disappear altogether, meaning the self, the ego, one would love to. But I have to be honest, maybe I'm not such a great performer, but there's only once in my life where that actually happened to me, where I completely forgot, well, actually twice in my life, where I completely forgot that I was on stage performing. Once was playing the Schumann Piano Concerto in Ann Arbor Festival, and what helped me on that day, I was very nervous playing the concerto, and when I walked out on stage, someone had left a banana peel on the stage, and my shoe connected with it, and I went flying into the air. The audience broke out laughing, understandably. I barely managed not to fall right over the stage, but that laughter just completely relaxed me. And when I sat down to play, indeed, I didn't care about Slava doing this concerto. It was the concerto, in a sense, doing the concerto. So there is, indeed, as Alan has said, a Buddhistic element to this, meaning that the ego is something that in the most fantastic moments is suspended. And the other time this happened to me, I was much younger. I was only, I don't know, maybe 17 years old. And when the audience clapped, I was completely amazed by the sound. But this only happened twice in my life. God bless any performer who can do that all the time. That's fantastic. I mean, that's what we want. That's what it's all about.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think that is the part of that ideal that you're trying to capture those moments, you know, when you can have that. But generally speaking, it's not the situation, right, that you find yourself in. So as long as you know that's your focus and your ideal. I think also what I was going to just say one more thing about attending to self and audience. I think that the point was a little bit missed about it being neither one nor the other. So it wasn't about the I and the self, and it wasn't all about the audience and their expectations. It's about what you're trying to get to in the between space. You know, that is what it is. It's a complex notion, but that's more than the sum of those two parts together. That is where you're going to get your energy. And when I was coming in here, partly because of the topic today, I felt as I was walking out there and the way we went out to start to play for you, I really felt that, you know, I was anxious, you were anxious for me, you were anxious anyway because you're thinking about performance anxiety, and there was a really heightened tension. I don't know if you felt it. I mean, it was just almost impossible to relax down out of that, because the minute I tried to relax down out of it, I'd pick it right back up again from you, from the audience. So we can't always be, you know, putting all this weight on our shoulders and saying it's all generated from me. You know, it's not generated just from you. It's generated by the combined thing. And I think that that unique thing happened. As I might relax down at certain parts of my performance, I could feel you took a breath. You sighed for a minute and went, oh, thank goodness she's not going to fall apart. And so, you know, as you would take that breath, that moment, then I could pick up that energy back again. So I think there's a lot of complexity here. We're not trying to say we have all or even partial answers for you. What we are trying to say is that we know a change has to take place, a transformation has to take place in how we deal with this topic. We have far too many years and far too much research that stayed in one model, stayed in one framework, and it hasn't moved us very far along. Right? And I think that we are taking over time. So I'm going to ask Ian to tell us, you know, I mean, you're being so polite and staying, but I'm not sure. I think we've gone over time. Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very, very
Ian.
much for your attention today.
Thank you, Susie and Slava. It was wonderful to hear you play and share some thoughts with you and some time with you. And thank you very much. The guests have all been here today and joined in our regular class on a Wednesday afternoon. And I'll see many of you again shortly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Can I just leave you with a silly little story, a cartoon that I hang on my office door. It shows the Dalai Lama getting a birthday gift from 4 monks. He opens it, and you know what he says? He says, oh, this is what I've always wanted. Thank you, nothingness. It's good, isn't it? When the students complain about their grades and all, I point to the cartoon. So take that with you. It's a great teaching ploy. Thank you very much for coming.